We're here with Dr. Andy Woods. He is a pastor at Sugarland Bible Church, and he's also the president of the Chafer Seminary. Dr. Woods, thanks very much for being with us.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And you gave a fascinating speech yesterday. We're at the Worldview Weekend Conference, and you talked about how globalism is unbiblical. Would you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. It really goes back to a belief in early Genesis, accepting Genesis 1 through 11 as his history and interpreting it literally. And once you do that, you start to see there's a story, or I don't even like to call it a story because that sounds like it's a myth, but an actual historical account, of man's first attempt at world government, which is in Genesis 11, about verses 1 through 9. It's a story we all read even as kids in Sunday school, but what it is man's first attempt at world government, and God wasn't happy about it, to say the least. He confounded the language. There was only one language at the time. The builders of the tower couldn't cooperate with each other. And consequently, what came out of that is the doctrine of the nation state. And so what you start to see is in the fallen world, God wants things ordered not according to world government, that leads to evil, but according to individual nations. It's kind of like the check and balance system in our own Constitution, where, you don't consolidate power in one person's hands. You have the three branches, divided power, check and balance one another. That's kind of the same concept with the nation state. And it says in Genesis 11, verse 6, if this project is not stopped, I'm paraphrasing, but if this project isn't stopped, God says nothing will be impossible for them. And I think he's not talking there about the potential for good, but the potential for evil. And you think about it for a minute, given man's fallen nature, and power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, how could the world be protected from evil if the only government that exists falls into the wrong hands? So God very wisely, at the dawn of human history, divided political power. And so you can see very clearly there that all this talk about world government and a new world order, God has expressed an opinion on it in Genesis 11.
So what should be the proper Christian response then to globalism, to efforts to dissolve borders and, create these regional super states and ultimately, one world government? How should an average Christian think about this? Should they take any particular action about it?
Well, to be frank with you, that probably is the definitive issue that we faced in the last election cycle and this one. And I think it came out crystal clear in the vice presidential debate that we've had so far, and in the presidential debate. I think there was a town hall last night that I didn't see, but the first presidential debate, and it was very clear that Donald Trump took us out of the climate Paris Accord. And both Harris and Biden said very clearly, as far as I remember, that one of the first things they're going to do, should they win, is to put us back under that Paris Climate Accord. So immediately when a Christian hears that, I think bells should go off in their head if they're biblically faithful, and saying, well, one candidate is favoring the precedent that God established at the Tower of Babel. The other candidate is against that precedent. So, to me, that's the definitive issue, in the last election cycle, this election cycle, and I would hope that the average Christian would pick up on that, and it should inform them, related to how to vote biblically.
And one of the other things you talked about was how the stage is being set for this global system. Education and management by crisis is something that really stuck in my mind. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? How are these people who are working this agenda using the education system, and how are they trying to govern using these crises to move us in that direction?
Mm-hmm. Well, education, there's a quote usually attributed to Abraham Lincoln, where he said, the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. And the people that founded our country understood that, with their emphasis on biblical education whether it's the great Ivy League institutions that arose on the East Coast, or you and I have talked a little bit about the old Satan deluder law there, where it's sort of the beginning of American education, and the purpose of it was to educate folks in grammar and so forth so they could read the Bible for themselves, because they came from Europe with a belief in the priesthood of all believers, as their post-Reformation children. And so they wanted, to create a society where people could read the Bible for themselves, because we're all priests. And if we're not reading the Bible, then we're deceived, as we were in the pre-Reformation Dark Ages, where only some people had the Bible, but not others. So that's the power of education. And the Puritans and so forth understood the power of education. Now the globalists understand it also. And so the very strategy that was used by the Puritans to create a Bible-based society is being used by the one-worlders, basically to create a society that calls out for humanism and world government. And so that's why I think they've intentionally, targeted education. And there's a great quote from a globalist in 1930 where he wrote a book called The Religion of Humanism. And as you know, one of the, humanism, it kind of reads like a doctrinal statement of a church. When you read the Humanist Manifesto, I think there was one in 1933, 1973, then there was Humanism 2000. You read through that, it's a short read, but you feel like you're reading a doctrinal statement of a church. And one of their tenets is one world government. Yep. So, the humanists have been ingesting that religion, into our educational system for a long time, with hopes of creating a humanistic society of the future, one of which is world government. So they've targeted education, just like the Puritans, put a high value on education. So I look at that as a stage-setting event, not even an event, but to capture them. All they need is one generation. Yeah. Capture the minds of one generation, and they've won. The management by crisis is sort of the strategy, that Adolf Hitler used, to really seize power finally in Germany, where he deliberately, and I think it can be demonstrated historically, started fires, I think in the Reichstag building, if I'm pronouncing that right, and he blamed it on his opponents and basically promised the people that, look, trust me and I'll resolve these crises, when in reality he's the one that created the crisis. So when we're afraid, we have a tendency as human beings to relinquish freedom to someone to fix the crisis for us. And I've been thinking about this. I think that's why the Bible, and even one of your slides I saw towards the end, you put up, was that you? God has not given us a spirit of timidity. I think that's why the Bible puts so much emphasis on not being afraid. Because when we're not afraid, we're not going to make foolish decisions. We're not logical when we're fearful. Yeah. And so when we're afraid, we're going to call for the heavy hand of government to fix the problem for us. And so the globalists have been looking for a long time for the right crisis. I think you can demonstrate that in their writings. Yeah. And obviously the crisis has to be global, because only a global problem will call us to demand a global solution. And I think that's why they've camped on the issue of the environment, trying to make that into a crisis. Because if I really believe that the earth is in a state of crisis, think of everything that can be regulated in my life and your life through international government. And they've got another crisis that they're using right now, I believe intentionally exploiting, with COVID-19, or I think you and others have called it COVID-1984. But this is a perfect environment to bring in one world government, because we're so afraid. Yeah. And so those are stage-setting events for the ultimate one world government of the future that God says will eventually come to the earth, that he will have to destroy.
So what should an average Christian, somebody watching this at home, they go to church, they believe the Bible, what should a pastor who, is curious about these things, what do they do in times like this? Does the Bible offer instructions? Do you have any ideas on what people should do in the face of what we're dealing with?
Well, I look at the whole thing under the lens of stewardship. A steward, we have the parable of the talents. A steward is not an owner, but a manager. It's someone who manages something on God's behalf. So all of us have three things that God has given us. He's given us time, talent, and treasure as Christians. And the day's going to come where we're going to be held to account concerning what we did with those things. Now, I think the American Christian is going to be held to a higher standard, because we have something here in the United States government that most people in world history, could only dream of. The unique system, constitutional system we have, the fact that our rights come from God and not man, and therefore man can't take them away. So I would just challenge Christians to look at, American Christians I'm speaking of, to look at their standing here in North America as a stewardship. And just ask yourself, what are you doing to be a good steward of what you've been handed? Because clearly you're going to be called to account for time, talent, and treasure. And to our stewardship, we need to add something else as American Christians, our own government. And, rather than have like a 5-point action list for people, I kind of would challenge them to look at everything in terms of stewardship. And that would include things like voting. It would include things like my daughter, who's 14. What kind of education do I have her in? Are these patriotic values being transferred in that education? And if not, maybe I ought to move to a different model, whether it's parochial school, private school, Christian school. Our family moved in the direction of homeschool, so that's something practical we decided to do. I'm not the product of homeschooling, I'm the product of public schools. But when Obama was not elected but re-elected, because I never thought Obama, I could see him getting elected. Anybody can get fooled once, right? We had Jimmy Carter, but the country corrected that. I didn't think the country would ever re-elect a guy like Obama. And once that happened, that was sort of earth-shaking for our family, because we were starting to figure out, there's something wrong with these kids and how we're teaching the next generation. So we moved from that to a homeschool understanding. My wife and I agreed to do that. My wife, carries the load, for that. But anyway, those are some examples of practical things that we as Christians can do, in light of, what God says about world government. I mean, I do believe in prophecy. I believe it's going to come to pass, but it doesn't have to come to pass on my watch. I think we're called to resist evil as Christians. Was it you that had up Ephesians 5:11? Yeah, about, have nothing to do with the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but expose them. Yeah. And I think we can actually slow down. I really do believe this, that we can, conferences like this, interviews like this, we can actually slow down the progress of evil. And that's what I would challenge Christians to do.
Dr. Woods, where can people find, I know you've got books, you've got videos, you've got a church. Where can people find more about you and get your materials?
Well, if they're interested in books, probably the easiest way is Amazon. I've got 4 books out there. If they're interested in verse-by-verse teaching, which is probably my specialty, they can get it at Sugarland Bible Church, www.slbc.org. We've got video, audio, teaching there with PowerPoints, and they can go to my YouTube channel. We've got like 590 videos uploaded there. We actually, in the middle of the week, we do a kind of a current events show, kind of like what we're doing here. Me and my associate pastor kind of just talk through events of the week. That's become pretty popular on YouTube. So just type in Andy Woods into their YouTube search engine. They should find me. And I have a website. If the folks just go to andywoodsministries.org, they can find it there.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Woods, thank you very much for your talk, for speaking with us, and thank you for all that you're doing.
And thank you for what you're doing. Appreciate you as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.